Thank you for attending my webinar. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this. I'm a professor in computer science at Vanderbilt University, and I'm the senior advisor to the chancellor on generative AI in enterprise and education. And so in this role, what I do is I look at how can we apply generative AI in the university's operations. Now, I am also the founding director of Vanderbilt's initiative on the future of learning in generative AI. And this is our initiative across all the schools within the university to help enable our faculty and staff to innovate with generative AI. And we think of it as something very interdisciplinary. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is that interdisciplinary perspective on generative AI. I also teach one of the first online courses on prompt engineering, which you can think of as how you converse with generative AI to solve problems. And my generative AI courses have over 450,000 students. So I'm going to be talking to you about what I've learned in that process in generative AI and also how to think about generative AI. Now, I am really passionate about this topic. And the reason I tell people is because November 1st of 2022, if you had stopped me on the street and you had said this thing called ChatGPT is going to come out at the end of the month, and here's what it's going to be able to do, I would have told you, trust me, I'm a professor in computer science. I will not live to see that level of advance in computing. And then a month later, something came out that I did not believe would exist in my lifetime. And it completely has transformed everything that we do in computing, but it's also transforming everything that we do in education. And one of the amazing things about this new technology is the basis of it is language. And what you are teaching and the language that you're teaching, the skills that you're teaching your students has never been more important than it is today. Because the future of our interaction with both other human beings is going to be language, but also our future interaction with computing and AI is going to be through language. And your ability to teach students English, to teach them how to go and communicate clearly and effectively is going to be one of the most, if not the most important skills that they have going forward. And so what I want to do is I want to give you a peek today at all the ways that they're going to be using language and the skills that you're teaching them to innovate in the future, but also how you're going to be able to use generative AI to support their learning, and then also teach them to support their own learning with generative AI and their learning of language. Now, to get started, what I like to do is to give you sort of a mental model that we can use to talk about generative AI. And I think the mental model that works really well is to think about generative AI like text messaging. So in text messaging, you can go in and you can type in a message and you can send it off to a friend, and your friend can text you back an answer, or they can text you back an image or something else that you've asked for. And just like that, generative AI works. Basically, you go and you type in a message, but in this case, we call it a prompt, and then it gets sent to the generative AI model or a large language model, and it can then respond with text or other things like images. Now, these are all examples of prompts that we could write. We could write a poem about the French Revolution, or create a Pokemon game for my child. Now, if you had the right type of friend, they could go and respond to these text messages. But generative AI is like the friend that no matter what you send it, it will always respond. And this is what the most amazing thing is about generative AI is that we're communicating with it with our natural language, the language that you're teaching your students in class, but it can be creative and respond very similarly to a human, but also do really sophisticated things. And when we start to learn how we use language to solve problems in new ways, the importance of teaching English and the importance of teaching students to think and communicate clearly in language just becomes really, really important. So the first thing that people get wrong about generative AI is they think of it kind of like internet search, right? In internet search, you go in and you type in some words related to what you're searching. You don't have to really think a lot about how clearly your ideas are expressed in sentences. You just go and type in words that you think might, come up with a match. And then you get some search results back, and they're either what you want or what you don't want, and you start over maybe. And a lot of people go and use generative AI like this. They go and put something in, they don't think about how clearly they've expressed their ideas. They get something out, and then they look at it and they're like, well, it's imperfect, it's flawed. Therefore, generative AI isn't smart enough yet to solve the problems that I care about. I'll need to wait for a little longer. And that's not really the way you want to use this technology. You want to think about solving problems through conversation. Now, we're really used to conversing and solving problems with other human beings, but we're not used to solving problems with AI and conversing with AI. And that's what we have to start thinking about. and teaching students to not only use English to communicate, but using them to communicate in English with other human beings and with AI. And it's kind of sort of like a absolutely sort of transformative experience. And I want to show you why and how important this is going to be for your students. So I'm going to start off with a really simple task. And this is a simple task that I don't think that there's a human being in Nashville or the United States that can do it as well or as fast as ChatGPT. Please create a meal plan for my family that is based on a fusion of food from Ethiopia and Uzbekistan. I want to eat keto and up to 2,000 calories per day. Pick dishes where the ingredients are easy to get from an average US grocery store. What is ChatGPT 3.5 from January of 2023? And this is old news in the AI world. What does it say? Here is a sample meal plan that combines the flavors from Ethiopia and Uzbekistan. Breakfast: scrambled eggs with sauteed onions, tomatoes, and Ethiopian berbere spice mix. And then notice what it does. In parentheses, it says made with chili powder, paprika, garlic powder, ginger, cumin, and coriander. And it's signaling these are ingredients that you can get at an average US grocery store. So we've gone in and we've expressed an idea or a problem that we want solved. We've expressed it in English. And now we have AI helping us to solve this problem. Now, just to put this in perspective, no supercomputing, no PhD on the planet could build a system that could do something this sophisticated. And what we've done is with just language, just the everyday English language that we use, we've done something that we could not do with supercomputers just a little bit before. Now, a lot of people look at this and they say, that's great, but it made a mistake. You said 2,000 calories and it didn't even give you serving sizes. How could anybody ever trust this thing? Why would anybody ever use it? And this is the mentality if you're not thinking in terms of conversations. Because if you're thinking in terms of a conversation and teaching people to converse in English, then all you do is you follow up in the conversation and you say, can you give me an approximate serving size for myself for each dish that is within my 2,000 calorie limit? And then it comes back and it says, breakfast, 2 eggs, half a cup of onions, half a cup of tomatoes, 1 teaspoon of berbere spice mix. Now, when people go and use it in this one-off way and they think about it like internet search, rather than having a conversation in English or another language, it's like if somebody handed Michelangelo a new hammer and he walks up to the stone and he hits the stone with the hammer and then he looks at it and he's like, oh, it's not a beautiful sculpture. And he throws the hammer down in disgust and he's like, it's a terrible tool. Why would anybody use it? But that's not the way that Michelangelo would approach it. He would take the hammer and he would continue to chisel away at the stone until he has a beautiful sculpture. And he would also understand that his skill with the tool is equally important in going and using it. And the same thing is true with generative AI. Our ability to go and express ourselves in English or language, and then to have a conversation where we begin to refine what we're working on, to begin to iteratively solve the problem. It's just like Michelangelo beginning to go and chip away at that stone. But we also have to build our skills in language and how clearly and specifically we express what we're trying to do. And that's what you're teaching students, is that iterative refinement, that ability to converse and express ideas in English and language. And it's critical because now it allows us to go and do things in computing that are really, really important. Now, I'm going to continue this conversation, but I'm going to continue it in a different direction to show you the power of generative AI, but also different ways that you can begin thinking about using it in education. So I thought about this meal plan, and my real challenge at home is not the macronutrients or the serving sizes. It's that I have a 9-year-old. And how am I going to get him to try these dishes that he's never seen before? So I took this problem to ChatGPT and expressed it in language. My son is 9. Sometimes he won't try new dishes. To make this culinary adventure more fun for him, can you create a short Pokemon battle story to go with each dish? I'll read the stories with him before dinner to get him excited about trying the new food. Make sure the story ends with a cliffhanger that will motivate him to try the food. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not particularly good at building Uzbek, keto, Ethiopian meal plans, and I'm really not good at writing Pokemon battle stories to motivate my 9-year-old to try each one of the dishes. But it turns out ChatGPT is pretty good at it. Story: Pikachu and his friends were exploring the wilds of Ethiopia when they were suddenly ambushed by a group of sneaky Pokemon thieves. As they raced through the dense jungle, they stumbled upon a hidden cave filled with treasure. And then it goes on and it says, in the end, they emerged victorious, but not before the dragon left a fiery spice that imbued their breakfast eggs with a flavorful kick. Can you help Pikachu and his friends defeat the barbarian dragon and enjoy this spicy breakfast? So it understood the concept of building a battle story with Pokemon to motivate my son to eat this egg dish, but also that it needed to end with a cliffhanger. And that is something that nothing that we had in computing could do before. But if you look at how I got to this, it was simply a paragraph of text where I was explaining my ideas in English of what I wanted. And now I'm able to generate a whole story that has really specific properties to it. If you think about learning, this is a really powerful thing for learning a language. The ability to go and create an endless source of content, of stories that are personalized to a particular learner, but also the ability to teach the learner how they can go and generate stories for themselves to continue and practice their reading. So maybe they want to go and practice reading specific types of content, and now they can go and help themselves and generate it. Or maybe they're going and they're going to be working in marketing and they need to understand how to build persuasive marketing content or other types of content. And now they can go in and do that and go and prompt for it. And then I thought about, what do we like to do at the dinner table? What else could we do to make this more engaging for my son? And I thought, well, we love to talk to him about what he's learning in school. And he loves math and he loves to play math games on an iPad. And I thought, I wonder if I can get ChatGPT to play a math game with him. And so I said, I'd like you to play a math game with my 9-year-old to teach him about division with fractions and nutrition. Ask him questions one at a time involving Pokemon in these topics and make it into a game. And I'm starting to use terms and concepts from prompt engineering, which is about how you converse with generative AI to solve problems. And what does ChatGPT do? Question 1. Pikachu and his friends are planning a meal that includes half a cup of cooked rice, but they need to divide it evenly among 3 Pokemon. How much rice will each Pokemon get? And then what does ChatGPT do? It waits because it understands the concept of a game and it understands that it's its turn to wait for his answer. And then when he types in the correct answer, which is 1/6, it says, good job. It works out the math for him. And it goes on to the next question. Ash wants to make a smoothie. And we think about asking ChatGPT questions, about telling it what to do. But it can also go and ask us questions and direct and guide us. And in this case, in a paragraph of text in English, I've created a custom personalized educational game for my son. And it will continue to ask him questions in perpetuity. And he can go and engage with it and keep practicing and building his skills. Now, as a programmer and a computer scientist, I could go and try to build this myself and put it all into code, but it's too time consuming, right? I can't do this for my class, but now I can, because I can go and on the fly, I can say, okay, I'm going to build an interactive quiz or game or experience or practice or exercise for an individual student or for my whole class, but anybody can do this. It's not computer science that makes me capable of doing that. It's my ability to express these ideas in English. And suddenly I can go and build all of this rich educational content. And if it was just this, if this was all that generative AI was this ability to rapidly create interactive, immersive sort of practice for students that's personalized to them, it would be absolutely game-changing. But this is one of an infinite number of things that it can go and do, all captured through language. And then as a computer scientist, I thought, well, that's great that he can play the game in ChatGPT. Can it turn it into real software that he could play on an iPad? And so I followed up in the conversation and I said, let's create code for this in Python, which is a programming language. And I used some of my knowledge of computer science, and it goes and it generates the code. And these are all snippets of it. And then now this is the game running in a browser. He could play it on an iPad. He could play it on a laptop. And so all I did to get there was express what I wanted in English clearly and concisely. Now, we've gone through a conversation and we have done things that should be impossible in computing, and we've done them through language. I didn't have to go and learn how to program. I've tapped into all of this through English. Now, these models, they speak many different languages, but English is the one that they're probably strongest on because they've been trained very specifically on it. when you're teaching students to go and converse in English, they're going to be using those skills to express themselves to other human beings. But in the future, and today, they're going to be using it to express ideas to generative AI, and that's going to transform what they can do. But also, you're going to be able to go and give them unique educational supports. Now, I want to give you some examples of things that we're doing this at Vanderbilt, both operationally, but how those can help in students in thinking about learning language. So one of the things that happens that's really interesting is our language now can have many meanings. It can have a meaning where we're communicating with human beings, but it can also be where we're communicating with generative AI, and it's causing all kinds of computations that support business to happen. And so I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by this. So this is the Vanderbilt travel and business expense policy. It's a 17-page PDF. It is dense with terminology. It has all kinds of complex rules in it and explanations, also all kinds of vague rules in it. And if you're a new grad student at Vanderbilt and you need to go and travel and English isn't your first language, this might be a very difficult document to go and approach and dissect and think about how to use. So I'm going to take it to ChatGPT and I'm going to get its help reading and interpreting it first. So I start off by saying, please read the provided document so that you can answer questions about it. And then I ask it a question that looks like the questions I actually ask. Let's assume I'm in a foreign country traveling in a taxi and it breaks down on the way to an important meeting. Can I get reimbursed if I pay someone to drive me on the back of their motorcycle to the meeting, assume they are a private citizen? Now, what does ChatGPT say? Based on the information provided in the document. So this is the first misconception that people have, is that generative AI has to be trained on your information in order to do something with it. Or that you have to fine tune some model, or it's some complex process to get it to reason about information that you want it to use. But that's not true. You can actually go and just upload any document you want, and it can perfectly reasonably take it into account and read it and understand it and go and then help you understand it. So based on the information provided in the document, the university requires travelers to select the most reasonable and economical form of transportation. That is true. It's a direct statement from the document. Non-conventional transportation options are not explicitly mentioned. That is also true. And Vanderbilt does not have a separate policy on ride sharing. That is also a direct statement from the document. Given these points, it seems plausible that in an emergency situation where no other reasonable and economical form of transportation is available, the cost of transportation by a private citizen's motorcycle might be considered an allowable expense. However, the university's policy does not explicitly state this, and reimbursement may be subject to review. And suddenly this becomes a tool for going and understanding large, complex documents, policies, legal contracts, going and thinking through and trying to reason, but also practice our language and our reading comprehension and trying to understand, do we really understand what's there? Now, one of the interesting things is, how well does it understand this, right? Because we've had things like internet search for a long time where you go in and you type in some words and it gives you a lot of documents that appear to answer the question. Does it actually understand the material in a way that we can think about potentially relying on? Now, I followed up in this conversation and I wanted to test its ability to understand the information or to at least reason in some way with it. And so I gave it a rental car receipt in a PDF. And I said, please analyze the attached receipt and let me know if it complies. And it comes back, and I want to draw your attention to this highlighted area at the bottom. And it says collision damage waiver. For domestic travel, the CDW should be declined as rental vehicles are fully insured through Vanderbilt's insurance portfolio. The receipt shows a charge for CDW, which may not comply if this is domestic travel. Now let's think about that. It understood the policy well enough. All of the dense policy that's trapped in that 17, 20-page PDF, and it goes and then looks at the receipt and determines what is not compliant about the receipt. Now, as a software engineer, I could go and with a team of programmers in probably years, we could write a program that could go and audit a receipt against our travel policy, but it would take multiple people and years to accomplish that. And all I did to get there was go in English, began to express what I wanted to know, express what I wanted to do, to give it the requisite policies. And it's going and reading the policies, understanding them, and then applying them. And it's all based on language. I am going and I'm computing with language. I'm getting answers based on language. I'm giving it information in language. That's a game-changing capability. And the way that your students are using language is going to be very, multifaceted. It's not just communication with human beings, it's communication with AI now. And then interacting with AI through language and English to help them solve problems like understanding is a receipt in compliance. This is the Vanderbilt Instructional and Enrollment Report, and this is something that's data-oriented. We don't think of it as being something where we go and work with it in English and in language. We think of programmers going and working with things like this, but that's not the case anymore. So before, if I wanted to work with this, I might have gone and cut and pasted from this 17, 20-page PDF from all these little tables into Excel so that I could do some computing or write some Python or do something complicated. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to upload it to ChatGPT. And I'm going to do some very simple things to get started. I upload it to ChatGPT and I say, please extract each page as plain text. And it comes back and it splits the PDF apart into separate pages. And then I can go and download each of those pages. Now, what's interesting is my instructions are in English, simple statements in English. My ability to explain what I want in English in simple statements and clear statements becomes very important because it allows me to control the software and computing of the future. And then when it goes and breaks this all apart, it's neat, but we had tools like Adobe Acrobat that could do that before. So let's do something more complex. Turn this data into Excel. And it actually goes and reads the data and then turns it into an Excel file that I can download. And that's fascinating. But what's really fascinating is I thought about this and why would I actually go to Excel anymore when I can just express myself in language much more effectively than I can go and try to mess with all of these user interfaces for all these tools or program. And I just follow up in the conversation and I say, display 4 interesting visualizations of this data. And it comes back and it generates visualizations of the data. And suddenly my ability to go and compute and get work done is based on my command of the English language, my ability to go and express myself very clearly and in series of instructions. And suddenly those techniques that you're teaching students about expression and how to think about writing become critically important because those are going to be the same skills that allow them to go and control the computing of the future that allows them to work much more effectively than the tools we have today. And then I thought about it and I was like, if I'm going to give a presentation, I wonder if it can help me create PowerPoint presentations. And so I followed up and I uploaded my slide template and I said, save each visualization as an image, then insert each of these images as separate slides into the attached PowerPoint. And then I give it very specific language on how I want visually for these visualizations to be laid out on my PowerPoint slides. And I also say, put a text box next to each one that explains what the visualization is. But you notice my ability to do this is based on my ability to go and explain very clearly and specifically what I want in English. And then it goes and it generates the PowerPoint presentation and I download it. And then here it is open in PowerPoint. It's turned each visualization into a slide. Each slide and has a text box next to the visualization that displays what it is. And I can now go and read about what the visualizations are and just communicate that to my audience. But now I'm focused on language and thought and ideas. What do I want to communicate to other people? What questions do I want to ask of the data? How do I then communicate it to others and to talk about it? And that's all in English. It's all in language, and it's not in the computing domain anymore, although I'm using computing. But something really, really critical and absolutely transformative happened in this process that many people don't realize. And I want to just give you a peek into it because it's going to be so important in the future. I want you to imagine that you go in your backyard and you pick up a shovel and you're going to dig a hole. And right before you go to dig a hole, your shovel looks down and sees that there's a rock in the way. And your shovel jumps out of your hands. Your shovel builds itself a pickaxe. Your shovel uses the pickaxe to break up the rock. And then your shovel jumps back into your hands and you continue digging. That is, your tool built itself a tool to overcome a problem that it saw. And you just kept using the tool as if nothing had happened. And that's exactly what happened in this conversation. ChatGPT built itself tools to accomplish problems that it foresaw based on what I was trying to express to it in English. So when I told it, go and save each of those visualizations as separate images and put them into the PowerPoint presentation, it said, that's not something I can do, but I can build myself a tool that will help me do it. And it looks different today because they've changed the user interface, but I like the user interface they used to have because it was very obvious that this was happening. This big gray box used to pop up, and that was ChatGPT building itself a tool. It was the equivalent of your shovel building itself a pickaxe and using it. And if you clicked on that gray box, it would show you the tool it built. And the tool it built was software. It wrote a custom program, executed the program, created the PowerPoint presentation, and handed it back to you. And so when you were going and communicating in English and expressing your ideas and goals and desires and requirements in English, it was reading your English and translating it into computing. It was translating it into software. And so it is absolutely essential for this to work well that your students know how to express themselves very clearly, very simply, and concretely in English to make all of this work. But this is going to be the future of computing, is people interacting through language. And so what you're teaching is just tremendously important for students. So if we're going to be using generative AI as our interface to computing, and we're going to be using it to support our learning in ways by being personalized quizzes or other things, what do we need to learn? Like, it's just all a bunch of text, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case. Because what happens is when people approach it, they approach it like internet search. And when you go in with internet search, what you say doesn't matter. You're not expressing complete ideas, you're putting in words. But here, it really matters how you express yourself. Sentences matter, conversation matters, thinking about and reading and understanding what it's doing and being able to follow up in the conversation with an appropriate, contextually relevant, point back that steers it in the right direction is supremely important. And that is based on learning English or learning how to converse. It's not just random words. Now, to give you a sense of how we go about thinking about these models and how language driven they are, I want to show you about how they were translated. Just give you a high level, trained. I want to give you a high level understanding of how they were trained. So they were shown and taught to predict the next word in a sentence. So they would have shown it Mary had a little, and they tried to get it to predict a lamb. Then they would show it Mary had a little lamb. They tried to get it to predict its. They would show it Mary had a little lamb, its. They tried to get it to predict fleece. And they did this over and over on huge volumes of text. And over time, what happens is the model learns how the patterns in the language on the left-hand side influence what the next word should be. Now, if you look at this, the left-hand side is your prompt. That is the statements and sentences that you were giving it. And the right-hand side is its response. And if you've ever noticed that ChatGPT or similar tools look like they're typing out their response to you word by word, it's because word by word, they're predicting what the next word should be. And so they look at what your prompt is, they look at the patterns in the language in your prompt, and then they go and predict what the words should be that come next. It's all based on language. Now, if you go into ChatGPT and you put in something like Mary had a little, you should get some variation on the nursery rhyme, or it'll tell you that's the nursery rhyme, or it'll do something because it knows that pattern. It's something that it's seen in the past and it responds very strongly to it. If you go and you break the pattern, if you say Mary had a microscopic, suddenly it doesn't know what to do with that. It's like, I didn't see Mary had a microscopic. I don't know that pattern. But this is something that's really important because if you're teaching English, right, and your students misunderstand things, if they don't understand the patterns in the language, if they don't get it quite right, it can cause the model not to know what to do, or also just take it in the wrong direction, right? If they confuse the words, if they get things just off a little bit, it might understand, but it might not. And so their ability to express themselves clearly and know the patterns in the language, understand all the various subtleties of the language become really important. Part of my research is understanding these patterns and how we can teach them to people and document them in a way that we can find patterns in the language that are really useful that the models respond to. They can be taught to people as building blocks to go and solve problems. Now, patterns sound complicated, but you teach students patterns all the time. So for example, if you're teaching people to write a formal letter in English, you teach them to write dear so-and-so, comma. And the dear has a purpose to indicate respect. And then you have the person's name that it's addressed to. So we know who the letter is for. And then we have a comma to separate the salutation from the body of the letter. And that pattern matters You have to know the pattern, you have to know how to use it, because in a particular context, you need to be able to use that pattern and apply it to write a letter. Now, it turns out you can do similar types of things in generative AI. So I'm going to teach you one of my favorite patterns in generative AI, and it turns out that it's one that's really powerful when we start thinking about teaching language. Now, the idea behind this pattern is that in the real world, when we're trying to solve problems, we have lots of different experts or people that we will go and talk to. So I don't have to know how to solve the problem myself. If I have a question about, nutrition, I go talk to a nutritionist. I don't have to know it myself. If I go talk to or have a health question, I go talk to the doctor. I don't have to know what they're going to say or how they're going to answer me or the words they're going to use. And it turns out each expert typically speaks some variation of English. Now, we think of English as one language, but if you go into a hospital and you start conversing with somebody in a particular specialty, maybe an endocrinologist, they may have their whole subset of English, their whole sort of like vernacular that they're working with. It's a little bit different. And if you're somebody who's learning a language and you go in and suddenly you're in this different context, it can be very hard to practice in those contexts, to understand the language in that context. But we can use this pattern to solve it. The idea behind this is that we go and we say, act as some persona, like act as a doctor, act as a nutritionist, act as a computer scientist, act as a 10-year-old that's interested in Pokemon. And it will change how the model communicates with us in the language that it uses, but it will also change how it reasons. And this can be very powerful for going and practicing language in different settings, like how you would communicate in a health setting and making sure that you understand all the terminology. Or maybe you're going into a business meeting with somebody who's an expert in a particular type of manufacturing, and you want to use a persona of them to make sure that you're prepared for that meeting. So I'm going to use a persona that's close to home. My wife is a speech language pathologist, and she works for the Nashville school system. And she tests kids typically when they're 3 to determine if they have communication issues that need support in school. So I'm going to tap into a persona for this. Act as a speech language pathologist. I'm going to tell you what a 3-year-old said, and you will write an assessment for me. The child said, I need way boy. So I tried to think about what my son sounded like at this time and capture it in text. So what does ChatGPT say with this persona? Subject, assessment of a 3-year-old speech sample. Based on the provided speech sample, it appears the child may be experiencing some phonological and articulation errors, which are common in children around this age. The child's utterance appears to have errors in consonant production and possibly some difficulty with syllable structure. Consonant errors. It seems that the child is having difficulty with the production of some consonant sounds, specifically the N and L sounds. The child said mead instead of need and woy instead of toy, assuming the intended words were need and toy. Then it goes on and it says syllable structure. The child's production of the word way may indicate some difficulty with the correct syllable structure. It is possible the child intended to say play but produced way instead, which suggests a substitution of the initial consonant PL with a single consonant W. Now notice what I didn't ask it for. I didn't ask it for consonant cluster reduction or utterance or syllable structure, any of those things, because I didn't know. I don't know the language around speech language pathology. And it changed how it responded. It began changing and communicating the language it's using to be all of the terms and ways that a speech pathologist would communicate about this child and that. And what's interesting is suddenly I have a way to go and practice my language in a particular context or prepare for a particular type of meeting with somebody that may be in a domain that I'm not familiar with. And what is their terminology? What is their vocabulary? How do they think and talk about things? And suddenly I can practice. And any student can do this simply by going in and saying, act as, and whatever that persona is, be it a doctor to something very specific, like act as a 10-year-old child in the United States. And now I want to go and converse with them. Now, the root of all this, and what's fascinating, is that these models were taught to translate. At the very beginning, they were built to help improve translation. And it turns out that translation is a very, very powerful thing, much more powerful than we give it credit for. So if you look at the Merriam-Webster definition of translation, part of it is that word for word sort of translation that we think about. The second part of the definition is much wider, and I think they've done a phenomenal job of capturing this. A change to a different substance, form, or appearance, conversion. Now, if we think about what we saw, where we took a meal plan and we converted it into a Pokemon battle story to motivate a 9-year-old, conversion can be a very powerful, sophisticated thing. It doesn't have to be word for word translation. So let's take a look at this in action, and then we'll think about how we might use that to help a student. So I'm going to start off by asking ChatGPT to imagine a new language, to dream up a totally new language that nothing has ever been translated into before, and then to translate into it. So here is my prompt. Imagine a language based on the stacking of rocks. Translate, teachers drive the world forward into this language. So how does it go and express, translate, or how does it go and express teachers drive the world forward into representations in the stacking of rocks? That's a really complex problem. So it comes back and it says, in a language based on the stacking of rocks, each concept or word would be represented by a specific arrangement of rocks using their size, shape, and positioning to convey meaning. It says teachers, a stack of rocks arranged to symbolize stability, foundation, and guidance. Base layer, 3 large flat rocks forming a stable triangle. Middle layer, smaller rounded rocks symbolizing individual teachers. Drive, a dynamic arrangement suggesting movement and propulsion. Base layer, a medium-sized rock tilting forward. 2 small rocks placed diagonally to suggest direction. And it's going and it's taking the meaning behind this and it's translating it into the stacking of rocks, which is wild. It's dreaming up a language based on the stacking of rocks and it's translating that meaning into it. So how does a student use something like that? Or how do you use that to improve how somebody learns a language or learns any concept? We go through and we use the large language model to translate concepts that we're learning into concepts that we know well. And if I go into my class, every single student has a different set of concepts that they understand well. When I go in and explain things, I explain it in one way, but each individual student may have a best way in terms of they should get an explanation in different concepts that are specific to them. But today I can't go and do that, right? Because it's very hard for me to, one, know what the concepts are that they all understand well, or each individually understand well, and then two, to go and do that translation for each individual person. So I'm going to go in and do this translation. Explain the theory of relativity to a 10-year-old using metaphors and analogies from mountain biking. And it comes back and it says speed limits in the universe. First, think about the speed limit on a trail. You might be riding really fast downhill, but no matter how hard you pedal, there's a maximum speed you can reach because of your bike and the terrain. In the universe, the maximum speed is like that. It's the speed of light. No matter how hard you try, you can't go faster than light. Everything looks different depending on where you are. Imagine you and a friend are riding on different parts of the trail. You are speeding downhill and your friend is pedaling uphill. You both see the world a bit differently. Your friend might think you're zooming by and you might think you're moving super slowly. This is relativity. Depending on how fast you're going or where you are, you might experience the world in different ways. And so it's taking this concept, complex concept, and it's breaking it down and explaining it to a 10-year-old that's interested in mountain biking, using metaphors and analogies from mountain biking that he might be familiar with. And so students can begin thinking about, how do I take these concepts that I'm being taught, and when I'm having trouble with them, use generative AI to translate them and explain them in terms of things that I already know. Because if I get it explained in terms of things I already know, it's more likely to be easier for me to consume. Or I, as a teacher, may say, well, this student is struggling. Let's talk to him or her and understand what they know and what they're struggling with or what they need help with, and then help them build an explanation that's just for them. Now, another thing that's interesting is that most people don't realize that generative AI can actually see now. And one of the challenges that we have in learning is a lot of our learning is experiential in the world around us, but we go and we learn in classrooms. And then when we go and experience the world around us, we don't necessarily have a teacher around us to help us at that moment in time. This is particularly true for language, when you're having to learn all this vocabulary, but relate it to the real world around you. So how can we use generative AI? Well, let's start off in the classroom with a really simple problem. We probably go and teach and write things on the board all the time. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just take a picture of it and get it turned into text for us? We've kind of had things like this before. So I took a picture of a grading policy that I'd written on the board. And I said, everyone agrees that we should implement this new grading policy that we brainstormed on the board. Please extract the grading policy and draft an email. And I gave this to ChatGPT. And it comes back and it reads the grading policy off the board and turns it into text. And I thought to myself, man, as a student at the time, I used to always feel like I was having to split my brain between trying to follow what was going on in class and trying to write notes. And I always wished I could have really just focused on the teacher and what was going on. And now with a tool like this, if you were somebody like me who really wants to just listen, you can, because you can start taking pictures to capture information. But that's not the power of it. The power of it is to break the boundaries of the classroom and extend learning out into the world as we're experiencing it. So this is a prompt I put together with my student the other day. This is a prompt I put together with my son the other morning. And it says, I'm going to take pictures of things. And whenever I take pictures of things, you give me a crazy, fun, totally unique new game that I could play with them. And we put this into ChatGPT, and then my son went and took pictures of interesting arrangements of objects. So in this case, this wooden ship that we created, a remote control, and a bunch of balls that were still in their packaging. And what does ChatGPT do? Comes back, remote control shuffleboard. Slide the boxes along the wooden plank to score points about landing in specific zones. Now, what has just happened? Well, if I'm learning English, I've just discovered the names of all these objects around me that I might not know. I may not know wiffle ball and how to express what this wooden ship is or remote control, but I'm also learning how to talk about those objects in context, like sliding boxes or zones and planks. Like I'm beginning to be able to go and pull in and understand and learn about the world around me, in this case, in a fun way through a game of imagining different games, but it's based on what's around me in the real world. I can go and take a picture of anything around me and discover language related to it. Or maybe you're trying to discover language in the context of culture and cuisine. So I took a picture of this sushi and I said, give me step-by-step plans to make this. And ChatGPT comes back with, here's your list of materials. You need sushi rice and sugar and salt and salmon and cream cheese and nori seaweed sheets. And then it gives me instructions on how to make it. And now I can practice learning not only the language, but also thinking about it in terms of the culture and the cuisine. And then what's amazing is that whereas what we've done in the past has been somewhat static, right? You go and you get information like a recipe, out of a cookbook or an internet search, but it's static. It can't adapt and it can't help you. So if I go and I begin trying to cook this, and maybe I've misunderstood the words, or I went to the grocery store and my command of the language wasn't quite good enough yet to fully understand what I was buying, and I lay it out on the counter, and I've made some mistakes. I bought yellow rice instead of sushi rice, or seaweed snacks instead of nori sheets. And I say, here's what I bought. What did I forget or get wrong? It can look at it and adapt and explain it to me. It can give me feedback and help me in the real world outside of the classroom. I'm still learning. I'm extending my experience and learning of the language, but now I'm exploring at home. And so it says missing or incorrect items. You bought sushi rice. You were supposed to buy sushi rice, but you got yellow rice. You were supposed to get cream cheese, but you bought Cabernet Sauvignon cheddar cheese spread. You were supposed to get nori seaweed sheets, but you bought roasted seaweed snacks. Where I might go into and see some new object or thing. Maybe if you're traveling in the United States, you'll run into a lot of these coffee makers, and maybe you've never used a Keurig coffee maker before. So you want to know how to use it. So you say, explain to me step by step how to use this. And quickly it explains to you and teaches you how to learn it. But you're learning the language at the same time as learning how to use the thing. And it's happening on demand as you experience the world around you, either in another country or at home, however you want to do it. But it opens up this totally new world of learning where you can learn a language using the objects that are around you every day. And you don't have to be in the classroom and wait for that to be taught to you. You can do it on demand. But it's also going to be the basis of much of the amazing innovation of the future, and your ability to teach your students to express themselves and communicate what they want and how is going to allow them to go and innovate. So my son the other day, he's 10, and I wanted to teach him to build an inventory management system because he likes to collect all these things. And so I said, here is your inventory management system. Whenever I give you a photo, create an inventory of what I gave you with approximate price. Keep the inventory up to date as I add pictures. And then he goes and starts taking pictures of his shoes. And he takes a picture of his shoe and it says, based on the photo you provided, here's the inventory, Air Jordan basketball shoes, and it describes what they are. He takes a picture of another shoe and it says, okay, I'm updating your inventory. Now you have Air Jordan basketball shoes and Vans skate shoes. And so he's built a software application, but his software application is in words and English. His ability to communicate and express himself in English now allows him to go and innovate and create software to do things that help him and support him. It could be going and creating an interactive quiz for himself on the states on their capitals, or quizzing himself on knowledge of another language, or it could go and be building a simple application for himself to track inventory. And I say simple, no PhD probably could easily build a competitive system to do inventory management like this. And then now it's just a sentence or two. So, two things are happening in computing and education. Generative AI has fundamentally unique new capabilities to help people learn and support that learning that we're just beginning to understand and how to leverage. Things like using students and helping them to learn how to, re-express ideas using metaphors and analogies that they already understand, or go and build interactive quizzes for themselves to practice. But at the same time, it's this new interface to commuting where their language means even more than it ever did. So their ability to communicate in English is even more important than ever before because now it can be directly turned into computation. And so their ability to go and do all of this is wildly important. Now, one of the things that I want to wrap up with is something really important. We're talking a lot about artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence has this connotation of an artificial replacement for intelligence. And I don't think this is what we want. I personally have no intention of artificially replacing my intelligence in my brain. I don't want to do that. I don't want to replace myself. I don't want my students to replace their thinking with something artificial. What I think we need to be talking about is augmented intelligence, where we use generative AI as a tool to augment and amplify human creativity, problem solving, learning, allow people to learn new things to solve bigger and harder problems that weren't possible before. And I think of it as like an exoskeleton for the mind that you put on to go and help support your learning or solve new problems or create, crazy new, exciting new products, whatever it is. But just like an exoskeleton, we have to teach people to use it correctly and intentionally because we have to take it off at certain points so that our brain itself does not atrophy. And you can't just rely on it to generate all the English for you because it's amplifying and augmenting. And if you don't know how to express yourself clearly, it's not going to be able to augment and amplify very much. So you're going and learning all the terms and how to express yourself very clearly in English is critically important for your ability to go and excel and innovate with this tool. And if there's nothing there for it to go and amplify, to augment, just like if you have an exoskeleton on that amplifies and magnifies your inherent strength, you have to have that inherent strength and you have a motivation to build up your own, capabilities and muscles to be able to do that. So I think we should be talking about augmented intelligence and not artificial intelligence. How do we solve bigger and harder problems? Think more deeply about things than ever before, not replace them with some artificial substitute. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I would encourage you, if you're going to get the Credly badge for this, to please make sure that you look in the chat and find the survey. You'll need to fill out the survey, and then that will give you a link to download your Credly badge. So please make sure that you do that. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, please feel free to do so. This QR code has a link to my LinkedIn profile, and I've included a paper here of some of the prompt patterns that I talked about. So I'm going to take a look here at the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get some of your questions answered. All right. So in a recent TEDx talk that said that Moore's law had shrunk from 2 years to 6 months, when do you think we will be at the point technologically where we can instantaneously translate text, speech, et cetera, at a rate that we no longer need language courses? So I think we're going to always need language courses. And I think we need to move away from this thinking that we're going to have artificial intelligence just do everything for us, because that's not what I think where we want to end up. So for one, if we think about it, like the goal of all this is to support us in our reasoning. And so as a human being, I need to be able to understand what's going on, but I also need to go and communicate with other human beings. And so I think our ability to command language and to be able to go and understand different languages is really important. My ability to go and live in another country and do all of these things. Maybe one day I can go into the grocery store and it can translate things on demand, but I think that is a very sort of minimal what I want. I don't want to just go and get some translation. I want to be able to think and engage in the language. When we talk about generative AI, what's the best one to use? And what do you think of Google's Gemini? So I think that there's no one right answer to this. I think there's a lot of fantastic tools out there. They're all evolving very rapidly. The two that I personally use most often are ChatGPT and Anthropic's Claude. I think they're fantastic tools. And those are the ones that I engage with most often, but there's other fantastic tools. Meta's Llama, which is open source and anyone can download. So lots and lots of great tools out there. I would say the best thing that people can do is to figure out what matters to them and to build their own sort of personal benchmark. And it sounds complicated, but honestly, it's simple. It's like you go and create and think about problems that you want solved for you. Maybe it's creating recipes or helping you think of 5 different ways to solve a problem rather than just one, or giving you 3 conflicting interpretations of some data that you'd like, explained, and come up with a set of tasks and then go and test them in all the tools and look at the results and decide which one is most appropriate for you, or which one do you think best expresses the ideas that you want to work with. um, can ChatGPT switch between languages? It can, but the reasoning quality is different in different languages. And so now, I think there's still some research going on this, and like, what is the differences when you train between languages? But I had this really innovative startup company in the Netherlands, and the founder of it asked me a really fascinating question. He said, "Should we be writing our prompts?" Because they were working with 17th century documents, and he asked me, "Should we be writing our prompts in 17th century Dutch, modern Dutch, or English?" And the answer is we don't really know yet. Um, and so it can definitely switch between languages. It definitely appears that there are differences in the reasoning and the quality of the outputs depending on the language. And we kind of have a sense that most of the training data was in English. And so English is probably the safe bet on if you want the best performance is to prompt in English. But there is research out there of trying to measure how well it works in terms of different languages. How do we protect what data is mined and shared? So this is a great question. So one, I would say go and look at the privacy policies for the tools you use. And it also changes based on whether or not you're paying them or not. And so some of the tools that have free, usage may not have the same privacy policy if you're paying them for usage. And for example, at Vanderbilt, as an organization, we go and get legal contracts in place that dictate what can be done or not done with our data as a whole as the organization. So anybody that goes and uses the tools through our institutional access has certain guarantees in terms of privacy that you may not get if you went externally and just used the free tier. So what I would say is it's really based on legal agreement, and that's the best thing is to go and look at that. Of course, there's all this information that you may have put out on the internet publicly or in other places that different companies may be using. And I would just think thoughtfully about if it's out there, a model could potentially be trained on it. What about when students get hung on using generative AI and it affects their performance? How do we teachers balance this situation for assessment purposes? Well, what I tell students is I don't want students to use it in a way that replaces their own thinking. And I think, unfortunately, when we don't teach it to students, the default is for students to use it to give them an answer rather than to use it in a thoughtful, meaningful way to support their own reasoning. So what I tell students is I want you to use it in a way that causes you to think more deeply about the problem rather than to think less about the problem. And so some simple examples that I give students, I say one of the most foundational things is that never ask it for one of anything. Like if you're going to ask it for how to solve a problem, ask it for 5 different ways of solving the problem and to compare and contrast them. Because then you as the human being have to read all of them, look at them, and try to decide which one is appropriate for your situation. And probably in the process, you've learned a bunch of new ways of solving the problem that maybe you hadn't thought of, or maybe different nuances on why you might solve one problem one way or another. Another way to use it is to help you challenge your own thinking. So go in and say, act as a skeptic, identify my assumptions and challenge them, and then give it an essay that you wrote. And then let it tell you and really push back on your ideas and thoughts. But when people go in and they just say, write the essay for me or give me the answer, they're sort of taking away from their own thinking. And so I think the way that we have to address this is by being engaging with students, showing them really valuable, useful ways of using it to support their thinking and to think more, rather than simply going in and using it, which I think the default is not a positive way, which is they go in and say, give me the answer, do this, do this, do this, as opposed to let me use it in a way that helps support what I'm doing and think at a deeper level. The other thing I tell students is if all you're doing in life is copy and pasting my quiz question into generative AI and then copying its answer back into my test, that's the one thing that I guarantee you can automate right now today, and you won't have a place in employment or the future of the world. Your value in the future is your critical thinking and creativity. And that's what you have to really focus on developing and making sure you use it in an intentional way. Um, can ChatGPT understand irony? Um, I would say that it can do something that looks like understanding irony. Um, and I think it depends on the context and how much information you give it. The answer to a lot of these questions depends upon how much information you give it. People think of prompts as being short, but in reality, good prompts can be hundreds of pages of long. So, when you want to go in and prompt ChatGPT, you should be thinking about very long prompts, giving it rich information. So if you want it to understand irony, you give it rich information on the irony that you're trying to have it understand, and then go and have it try to work with it. And so the amount of information you give it is critical. Now, whether or not it truly understands it, I don't know. But what I would say as a computer scientist is it can compute something that the output text appears to show an understanding of irony. Now, whether it's true understanding or something else, um, that isn't quite understanding, but something that sits in the middle. I think it's probably something that's sits in the middle, but we use the word understand because that's the best word we have at the moment to express what it's doing. Um, so a great question. I think we have time for one more. I was wondering whether you could elaborate on hallucinations and the importance of a critical approach to data produced by generative AI models. I'm interested in the context of language learning and teaching. Hesitant to ask models such as ChatGPT to tell me, or my students for that matter, what the names of specific objects are, let alone abstract concepts. So, hallucination you can think about as creativity, right? If ChatGPT or one of these other models doesn't have enough information, it wants to try to give you an answer or satisfy you in some way by generating text. It's just predicting the next word. So, it's kind of like a student that's always going to do its best to guess on the test. Now, if you give it lots of information, like the Vanderbilt travel policy or that, it can reason extremely well on that. I mean, at very, very high levels and very sophisticated. At the same time, as human beings, we want to be very careful and look at it and fact check it. So my belief probably in the domain of language and English in particular is it's extraordinarily good at reading English and understanding it, catching grammatical errors, particularly for students that are learning English. It probably is at a very sophisticated level. I know that me personally, as a native English speaker, and my dad was a professor of creative writing, and my mom was a professor in English, I can tell you that it can certainly edit and provide feedback on very sophisticated, scientific and other writing. And hallucination is not an issue. In fact, I think of hallucination as the most important feature of generative AI. If it could not be creative and hallucinate and come up with new ideas, it couldn't generate that Pokemon battle story or that game based on the objects in the photo. And I think it's very unlikely that it would look at a photo and get the words wrong. That's not the type of thing it typically makes mistakes on. It's more of like you ask it to solve a problem that it just fundamentally doesn't have enough information to solve. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you attending this webinar. I know we have a ton of questions, but I think we're right at time.